and Bruno. And then, Bruno, you're going to take our last question of the year with you. And then this is from, yeah. So this one is from another agent. So thank you to our agents once again. And it goes, if a written offer is received on an apartment that is currently rented out fully furnished until end October 2024, and the transfer into the new owner's name is set to take place March 2024, must the seller legally leave the furniture behind until the end of the lease when the new terms can be negotiated? What are the seller's options here? The buyers, by the way, are in favor of the tenant staying and do not want to lose the tenant as they are buying the property as an actual investment. Bruno?
So simple answer, I would first have a conversation with the seller regarding this, just to try to figure out what's going through the seller's mind. So let's divide this question into two quickly, right? So the first answer is going to be based on the terms of the lease agreement. So remember, with immovable property, if a person sells immovable property to somebody else and there's an existing lease agreement, through the principles of huur, gaat, voor, koop, the lease moves from one person to the other. So we all know this, we've discussed it a million times, right? So that's given. So now we start speaking about what about the movables? So, and this was actually an interesting conversation that Nick and I were having. The reality is the movables, or rather the flat with movables, form part and parcel of the lease agreement. It's highly doubtful that the lease agreement in any way severed one from the other, meaning that if the lease obligates the landlord to provide certain furnishings, then it is part of the lease and the tenant will be entitled to demand those furnishings from the landlord. So that's one component. So will the tenant be entitled to furnishings? Yes. Will the tenant be entitled to those specific furnishings? Now, that would depend on the lease. It's unlikely because in practice, a person does not specify a very specific bed. Maybe they'll specify it's a king-size bed, but they won't specify that it's that king-size bed bought at that store with that serial number under that warranty, right? Unless this is a very luxurious apartment where things like that actually matter to the tenants. So if the lease agreement does not specify the items specifically, but specifies the items that should be there, then arguably the furnishings or the furniture need not form part of the sale, but the landlord, the new owner will be obligated to ensure that he performs in terms of the lease, which may involve refurnishing the apartment, right? So that's something now to bear in mind. Now, there's probably going to be a little gap now where furniture is removed and new furniture is placed in, and that's obviously going to cause a problem. And depending on the terms of the lease agreement, you may actually find that the tenant won't pay rent for that day or whatever the case is, right? I don't think that the seller is obliged to keep or to give the furniture to the new owner. And I don't think that the new owner will be obliged to demand that he receive it, but the tenant will. And it doesn't matter where he claims it from, the tenant will get furniture one way or another. The second component to this is the sales component. Now, is the purchaser entitled to claim the furniture from the seller? That you'd look at the sale agreement of the property. The reality behind it is certain things that you buy when buying immovable property can be considered to be part of that immovable property. Now, typically furniture isn't, right? That's the reality, because furniture belongs to the landlord and he gets to keep his bed and whatever the case is. But depending on how this property was marketed, depending on how this specific unit was represented, it's a business. It's almost a going concern that you're selling as part of this property. So could it be argued that the intention of the parties was to include furniture in the sale? Absolutely. Because it's not normal furniture, it's part of the business. And as an investment property that was marketed as an investment property, that was marketed as having a tenant, the tenant is being retained and. So there is an argument to be made that the purchaser could claim from the seller this furniture as part of the sale, deeming it to have been included in the object of the sale. If the sale agreement's silent, you could try read it in, but yeah, it does become difficult because if it's not in writing, you'd have to look at specific clauses. You'd have to try and argue that it's a fixture or some kind of, it should be there with some degree of permanency. So I'm not saying it's an easy argument. I'm just saying it's an argument. So yeah, I hope that answers the question somewhat.
Right. Okay. Thank you very much, Bruno. And that does bring us to the end of this year's episode. Thank you very much. Thank you everybody for watching. Wishing everybody a safe Merry Christmas and a nice and good return in the new year. Thank you, guys.
Thanks, guys.